Hi, everyone. I am going to tell you a little bit about Charles Tilley. He was born in 1929 and he passed away in 2008. He was born in Lombard, Illinois, to Naneth and Otto Tilley. He had a younger brother named Richard, who is actually a historian. He was married to Louise Tilley, and even though they were estranged at the time of his death, they had 4 children: Christopher, Kit, Laura, and Sarah. Charles Tilley had an extensive education. He earned his bachelor's magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1950, and he also received his PhD in sociology in 1958 from Harvard University. In between those times, he studied at Balliol College, Oxford, Facultés Catholiques de l'Ouest. I hope I'm saying that right. My Spanish is a little rusty. Angers, and he also served as a naval officer. During that time, he had some odd jobs. He was a newsboy, he was a grocery clerk, a factory hand, a janitor, and he also worked as a psychiatric hospital researcher. It's a pretty big leap from his odd job as a newspaper boy. So Charles Tilley served on many, many advisory boards, and he held numerous positions at a number of prestigious universities, including Harvard, the University of Michigan, and Columbia University. He was also at Delaware, where he served as a professor from 1956 to 1962. He was a professor at Harvard from 1963 to 1966. He was a professor at the University of Toronto from 1956 to 1969. He was a professor of history from 1969 to 1984, and a professor of sociology from 1969 to 1981 at the University of Michigan. He also had a position at the New School for Social Research from 1990 to 1996. He held many positions at Columbia University. He did a lot of economic research, and he was also a keynote speaker and gave many lectures on sociology throughout the country. So Tilley's research focused on the political populations that aim to improve conditions for their citizens. One of the articles that I found was a book called Regarding Tilley, Conflict, Power, and Collective Action, that was published in 2016 by Mara Funes and Maria Rivas. And they talked about how Tilley encouraged the grassroots movement. So not a lot of people know what the grassroots movement was. That was when everyday citizens and local organizations attempted to motivate citizens. It centered around Europe after the decline of the Roman Empire. And so what it was all these small communities. They kind of got together, they realized that they needed change, but they didn't quite know how to do it. And so what they did is they rallied together for this change that would affect them. And they would help hold small protests, and they really got their voices heard. And so policies, were updated and they were changed that benefited these very communities that started the movement. So Charles Tilley wrote a number of books. He published many, many works throughout his lifetime. A few of them that I've mentioned here is The Vendée, An Urban World, and Coercion, Capital, and European States. So one of the key concepts was urbanization. Tilly aimed to show that small communities can be a type of social network, and that ultimately created the grassroots movement, which I previously mentioned. Here's what the title cover of those books that I mentioned look like if you are interested in reading any of Charles Tilly's works. So one of the passages that Lemaire had touched on was called Social Science and the Invisible Elbow. That is from Tilly's larger works, Roads from Past to Future, and that was published in 1997. So what this excerpt talked about was how people attempt to improve their actions through trial and error. And the situation that Tilly talked about was, have you ever came home with a handful of groceries? I, for one, do not like to put down my groceries in order to open the door because I'm stubborn. And so a lot of times I'll try and use my elbow, my hand, or not my hand, but my foot, my knee, anything that I can to try and open up the door in order to not set my groceries or anything else that I have my hands full with at the moment down. And so the first few times that, you try to open up the door with your elbow, you'll probably spill the groceries all over the floor, or I'm sure you'll get some bumps and bruises after, a few tries of not being able to do it. But with some practice, you're able to eventually open the door, kind of perfecting your method. And so he had attributed this to history and, to like politics, and how, throughout history, we try to open the door with our elbow. And a lot of times we don't succeed, but we learn from our mistakes in order to perfect it. So Tilly had stated the big difference among persons and groups not lie in the frequency in which they make mistakes, but in the speed, frequency, and manner of the corrections. Smart people correct their many errors fast and well. So humans make errors. But part of being human is that we can learn from our errors and correct it. That way, history doesn't have to repeat itself. Until he believed that social theory is like that. So social theory takes what actually happens and the possibility of what could have happened and compares them to known causes to determine the different outcomes. So Tilly researched historical events, and he saw what happened there and the possibility of what could have happened if different steps were taken. And he tries to figure out what caused us to do what we actually did instead of doing these different outcomes. And a lot of that goes into ethics. A probable outcome is examined as well as the opposite of that outcome. And Tilly did that. He examined the outcome that happened as well as what could have happened if he was in a position where he had to help make a decision. And he would advise of the best action to take based on historical events. In social theory, we have to account for human error. And because of theorists like Tilly and others, human errors can be predicted by the research on historical events. And so history doesn't have to repeat itself. When Charles Tilly was looking at those historical events, it could help him predict what would happen in current times whenever he was asked to advise on a certain situation. He could determine possible outcomes and give that information to whoever he was advising. Our human nature is to learn from mistakes, and that's what Charles Tilly did. He would learn from the mistakes in past history, and he would try to help this country from making the same mistakes again.